And the teachings around grief are not simply grief expressed when we lose a loved one, but grief as what I call grief is not a personal dilemma, but a collective responsibility. That an outpouring of grief in many indigenous cultures is a way to keep the pathways open uh, between one in one's heart and one in one's loved one, and to move this energy that in our culture here in the West often becomes atrophied and unexpressed. Um, the Buddhists talk about the hungry ghost, or I've heard Martin Prechtel, Guatemalan shaman, speak of this hungry ghost that is unexpressed. It moves into a form of itself and then starts to transition through family generations. And it can come from grief over the loss of a loved one. It could come from cultural trauma. As we say, what have happened to the Native Americans or to the Irish when 2/3 of their country left because of the potato famine or the Highland clearances. These cultural traumas that happen, and then that kind of grief often moves through family systems and expresses itself differently. And then there's the grief that is deposited in the land. When I think of the earth, I don't think of the land as being in grief. I think of the land and the earth as holding our grief, as a parent would hold the grief of a loved one. So the grief that we don't acknowledge or express goes into the land and is held there. So I've heard many stories of people that are sensitive to that kind of grief will walk into a place and then they themselves become a vessel or a conduit of release, sometimes surprising them. So there are places in the landscape where there have been turmoil or loss or disruption, where this grief is then just embedded in the land. And so grief rituals are just to move that energy when one dies in this world. Let's think about a human death. An outpouring of grief is necessary to assist them in crossing that river or going down that river. You know, in mythology, we'll hear about the river Styx. This traveling from this world to the world, one travels on a river of grief. Without the necessary outpouring of grief needed at these different times, one can get stuck. The soul, the one who died may not cross over completely and then become lodged in this world without a body, or sometimes what we'll see is that like suicide and accident, people hold to this river because they acknowledge grief. And so grief is celebrated. Martin Prechtel talks about grief and praise as this fine edge where at one moment there's an outpouring of grief and loss, and at the other moment these immense feelings of gratitude and heartfulness. I know that in my own life, experiencing the loss of my father back in '94 became very much like that. There was this initial outpouring of grief, and then all these years later, whenever I feel the tears moving down my cheek thinking about my father or missing my father, it's a gratitude. It's I never want that to go away, because as I feel that grief, I feel the connection. So it has a way of us to each other in the world, connecting us across the across the worlds to loved ones in the other world. So not something to be afraid of or avoided.